On a humid July morning in 1962, in the small Midwestern town of Galesburg, Illinois, a 4-year-old child vanished from the edge of his own street. The time was just after 9 o'clock. The place was a quiet residential block where doors were rarely locked, and where the sound of cicadas blended with the low hum of passing cars. Noah Price had been seen moments earlier, barefoot, close to home. Then he was gone. No scream carried down the block. No sudden noise broke the stillness. His absence arrived silently, like a held breath that never released. The realization came in fragments. A house that should have been louder. A child who should have been underfoot. His mother moved from room to room, calling his name into spaces that did not answer. Outside, the pavement shimmered with heat, and the air felt heavier than it had minutes before. When the neighbors began to look, they scanned the familiar lawns, hedges, porches, assuming the boy had wandered only a few steps too far. But time stretched. The minutes passed without resolution. The certainty set in slowly, and then all at once. Something was wrong. For the Price family, the shock landed with physical force. A morning that had begun like countless others collapsed into confusion and fear. Noah's sister, older by just a few years, stood frozen near the front steps, replaying her last memory of him following her, small footsteps matching her own. That memory would become permanent. The house itself seemed to recoil, its rooms suddenly too quiet, its corners sharp with absence. Parents who had trusted the boundaries of their block now stared past them, imagining distances they had never before considered. There was something immediately unsettling about how completely Noah disappeared. No overturned trash cans, no torn clothing, no footprints leading away from the yard. The neighborhood children had not seen him leave. Adults had not noticed a stranger arrive. One moment he existed within the narrow orbit of home, routine, and safety. The next, there was only a gap where a child should have been. Even in those first hours, before suspicion hardened into theories, the silence itself felt like an irregularity too clean. Too final dot as word spread through Galesburg. The town responded with instinctive urgency. Screen doors slammed. People abandoned lunches half-eaten. The streets filled with searching figures, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. Yet beneath the movement was a growing dread. Children did not simply evaporate from streets like this. Someone noticed, someone remembered later, a car idling too long at the corner earlier that summer. A detail that would not surface fully until much later. In 1962, it was only a vague discomfort, an unshaped fear that hovered just beyond language. Decades from now, this case would be labeled unresolved. It would pass from active investigation to whispered memory, from urgency to endurance. And yet, long after the summer of 1962 faded, something would shift. A fragment would resurface. A silence would be disturbed. But on that morning, none of that was visible. There was only the open wound of not knowing, already beginning to scar over with time. This story unfolds slowly, through memory and loss. And if you want to follow it as it develops, subscribe now to continue with this documentary journey. Galesburg, in the early 1960s, was the kind of town that measured time by school years and harvests. Tree-lined streets curved gently, their sidewalks cracked by decades of winters. The houses leaned into one another, close enough for voices to travel through open windows. On that day, the weather pressed down, thick and unmoving, as if the town itself was holding still. Flags hung limp. Even the wind seemed reluctant to interfere. Noah Price fit seamlessly into this environment. He was small for his age, shy, with a quiet smile that adults often described as thoughtful. He spent his mornings near home, rarely straying beyond sight. He followed routines closely, not out of discipline, but out of comfort. Breakfast at the same table, playtime in the same patch of shade. He depended on the presence of others, his sister especially finding reassurance in proximity rather than words. His world was measured in a few blocks, a few trusted faces, a handful of familiar sounds. To neighbors, Noah was easy to miss in the way children often are. He did not demand attention. He lingered at the edges, watching more than speaking. That morning, he had been doing exactly what he always did, staying close, existing quietly within the safe geography of home. There was no sign that anything about the day was different. No argument, no urgency, no visible threat. When he disappeared, the spaces he left behind began to change. The patch of ground where he had last stood became significant. The front steps, worn smooth by years of use, took on a new gravity. Every object seemed to remember him more vividly than the people did, as if the physical world had noticed his absence before anyone else allowed themselves to. Galesburg would carry that absence forward. Season after season, its streets unchanged. Its silence altered. By nightfall, the search had expanded beyond the neighborhood, but the emotional center remained fixed on that single street. Parents pulled their children closer. Windows stayed lit longer than usual. The sense of safety that had defined the town fractured quietly without announcement. Something essential had been taken, and no one yet understood how permanent that loss might be. Before the disappearance, Noah Price's life was defined by repetition and closeness. His days unfolded in predictable patterns that gave him comfort. Morning light through thin curtains, the sound of his sister moving ahead of him, a guide through a world that still felt too large. He was not yet old enough to attend school, and his universe was narrow by design. Home, yard, sidewalk, the familiar rhythm of adults passing in and out of his awareness. He clung to routine not because it was imposed, but because it made the world manageable. Noah was a quiet child, often mistaken for being withdrawn. In reality, he observed more than he spoke. He listened to tones, to footsteps, to the subtle emotional weather of the adults around him. Loudness unsettled him. Sudden change made him retreat inward. When he smiled, it was brief and genuine, as if the act itself required effort. Those who knew him remembered his hands first small, often fidgeting with the hem of his shirt or the edge of a toy, grounding himself in texture when words felt unnecessary. His bond with his sister shaped much of his inner life. He followed her instinctively, trusting her movements as signals of safety. Where she went, he felt permitted to exist. Without her, he hesitated. That dependency was not weakness. It was attachment, the kind formed when a child understands the world through proximity rather than explanation. In the days before he vanished, there had been nothing to suggest the bond would be severed so abruptly. Inside the Price household, there were unspoken tensions typical of the era but rarely named. Adult worries lived quietly in corners: money, expectations, the pressure of appearing stable in a town that valued order. Noah absorbed these things without language. Children often do. He sensed when voices lowered, when movements became sharp, when smiles were practiced. None of it translated into fear, but it shaped his need for reassurance, his preference for staying close to what he knew. Neighbors later recalled how Noah rarely wandered. He did not test boundaries the way other children did. He stayed within sight, within sound, within reach. His routines were small but precise. He favored the same patch of ground, the same toys, the same time of day. Change unsettled him, and yet the summer of 1962 brought changes he could not understand. Longer days, heavier air, more people moving through the neighborhood at irregular hours. Even so, nothing outwardly marked him as a child in distress. What lingered beneath the surface was a quiet sensitivity. Noah felt things deeply, but processed them privately. When overwhelmed, he withdrew rather than cried. That withdrawal would later haunt those who searched for him. wondering if fear had kept him silent, if confusion had rooted him in place rather than sending him toward help. These questions would never resolve. They would only repeat, reshaped by time and regret. The disappearance did not only remove Noah from his routines, it froze them in place. His toys remained where he had left them. His clothes stayed folded, untouched. His bed went unmade for days, then weeks, then longer. As if disturbing, it might erase the last physical proof that he had existed there. His mother moved through the house carefully, avoiding certain rooms, while his father lingered at doorways, uncertain where to direct his attention. The absence became an active presence, pressing into every ordinary task. For his sister, the emotional impact was immediate and enduring. Her last memory of Noah following her became a burden she carried quietly. Childhood memories are not linear. They return without warning, triggered by places, seasons, sounds. For her, the sound of bare feet on pavement would never be neutral again. Guilt settled early, long before she had the language to describe it. She replayed the morning repeatedly, searching for a moment where she might have acted differently, a moment that could have changed the outcome. The town, too, began to internalize Noah's absence. Parents altered routines. Children were called inside earlier. Familiar freedoms narrowed. Galesburg had lost more than a child. It had lost a certain innocence, the belief that proximity equaled protection. Over time, Noah's name became both a reference point and a cautionary whisper. New families heard it in fragments, an unfinished sentence passed down through generations. Grief in cases like this does not resolve. It calcifies. It becomes part of the emotional architecture of those left behind. The Price family learned to live around the missing space rather than through it. Holidays came and went with an extra chair unfilled, an age forever frozen at 4. Questions replaced answers. What had he felt? Had he been scared? Had he waited for someone who never arrived? As you reflect on Noah's life and the quiet routines that defined it, you are invited to share your thoughts or reactions in the comments, adding your voice to the ongoing remembrance of a child whose story remains unfinished. Years later, photographs of Noah would fade at the edges, their colors softening, but the emotional clarity of those early memories would remain sharp. His inner world, his sensitivity, his dependence, his quiet presence would become the lens through which the tragedy was remembered. Not as a headline, not as a mystery alone, but as the interruption of a small, careful life that never had the chance to grow beyond its earliest boundaries. In the days leading up to Noah Price's disappearance, nothing outwardly dramatic marked the passage of time. There were no arguments remembered, no sudden changes in behavior that adults could later point to as warnings. Instead, what stood out only in hindsight were subtle shifts so ordinary they almost disappeared into routine. The summer air lingered longer each morning. The streets felt busier, less predictable. The familiar rhythms that once moved quietly around Noah began to feel slightly out of step. Noah remained close to home, as he always had. Yet those who later searched their memories recalled small hesitations, moments when he paused before stepping forward, when he lingered just behind his sister rather than beside her. These were not dramatic signs, just fleeting impressions shaped by grief after the fact. At the time, they registered as nothing at all. Children change from day to day. Sensitivities ebb and flow. Nothing about Noah suggested he was preparing for disappearance. Emotionally, his inner world remained private. He did not articulate fear. He absorbed it. If something unsettled him, it surfaced as silence, as stillness. Adults mistook that stillness for contentment. In truth, it was simply his way of processing a world he did not yet have words for. In those final days, he seemed more watchful, his attention drawn to sounds outside the immediate circle of family cars slowing. Doors closing, footsteps that did not belong. The morning he vanished began without urgency. The sun rose into a pale sky, already warm. Inside the Price home, the routines held. Breakfast was eaten. Shoes were left near the door. Noah stayed close, moving in small arcs around the people he trusted. There was no sense, at least not consciously, that this was a last morning. The human mind resists that framing. Only later does time rearrange itself, assigning weight to moments that once felt weightless. Psychologically, Noah was a child still anchored in expectation. He believed that if he stayed near what he knew, the world would behave predictably. That belief is fundamental to early childhood, a quiet contract between safety and obedience. Stay close, and nothing bad will happen. That assumption shaped his movements, his decisions, his silence. It may also have shaped how he responded in the moments that followed, when routine broke without explanation. If there was fear, it likely arrived not as panic, but as confusion. A child of 4 does not immediately understand danger. He understands disorientation. Familiar reference points disappear. Trusted patterns fail. In such moments, children often freeze rather than flee. They wait. They listen. They assume an adult will reappear and correct the mistake. That waiting, that faith in eventual rescue, is one of the most devastating possibilities to consider. As the morning progressed, the neighborhood shifted around him. Adults moved in and out of sight. Sounds overlapped. The predictability Noah relied on thinned. Somewhere in that narrowing space between routine and rupture, he became separated from his sister, from his home, from the structure that had always defined his safety. There was no record of his emotional state in that instant. Only the knowledge that whatever he felt it alone. Later, speculation would question whether he sensed something was wrong. Whether a quiet child might have been less likely to call out, less likely to run. These questions linger because they cannot be answered. They exist in the space between empathy and imagination, where grief seeks understanding but finds only echoes. What remains certain is that Noah did not leave behind signs of resistance or struggle. His disappearance was as silent as his presence had been. In the hours before he was noticed missing, time moved differently for everyone else. For Noah, those hours may have stretched, distorted by uncertainty. Children experience time through emotion rather than clocks. Fear lengthens minutes. Waiting feels endless. If he waited with the expectation that someone would come. That expectation, once broken, becomes something else entirely, a realization too large for a child to process. The final confirmed memory of Noah alive is ordinary to the point of cruelty. Bare feet on warm ground. A familiar street. A sister just ahead of him. Nothing cinematic. Nothing overtly tragic. The weight of that memory comes not from what happened, but from what did not. No intervention. No interruption. No adult stepping into frame to restore order. When investigators later reconstructed timelines, they worked with gaps rather than facts. They marked windows of possibility instead of sequences. But emotional timelines are harder to chart. They ripple outward, touching everyone connected to the moment. For the Price family, those final days became a loop they could not escape. Replayed endlessly, with the hope that repetition might reveal something missed. If this account resonates with you, taking a moment to like the video helps ensure that stories like Noah's continue to be told with care and attention. What remains most haunting about Noah's final days is their quietness. There was no escalation, no visible threat, no clear turning point. Just a gradual drift from certainty into absence. The psychological truth of that drift, especially for a child who trusted routine, above all else, adds a layer of sorrow that never resolves. By the time the alarm was raised, whatever internal experience Noah had endured was already sealed into the past. The town would move into action. The family would enter shock. The investigation would begin. But Noah's final emotional landscape, shaped by confusion, dependence, and waiting, would remain unknowable, carried only in the imaginations of those left behind. The moment normalcy collapsed did not announce itself. It slipped quietly into the morning, unnoticed until it had already passed. For Noah Price, the world did not end with a sound or a struggle, but with a sudden dislocation from everything that had defined safety. One moment, the familiar geometry of home and street still held. The next, it did not. Whatever occurred happened within a narrow window of time and space, small enough to evade witnesses, large enough to erase a child completely. Fear, if it came, likely arrived slowly. Children at 4 do not immediately recognize danger as adults define it. They sense wrongness before threat, a change in tone, a shift in environment, the absence of what should be present. For Noah, the collapse of routine may have been more terrifying than any overt act. His instinct would not have been to resist, but to wait, to stand still, to look for a familiar face, to assume the world would correct itself. There were no confirmed sightings after he vanished from the edge of his street. No reports of a child crying. No neighbors recalling a struggle. The silence surrounding the event is one of its most enduring features. It suggests a moment of confusion rather than chaos, a disappearance shaped by quiet compliance or disorientation rather than force that drew attention. That silence has haunted the case as much as the lack of evidence. Internally, Noah's emotional experience can only be inferred. He was a child who depended on proximity, who measured safety by closeness. Separated from that closeness, his psychological anchor would have loosened. Confusion would have given way to fear, not because of immediate harm, but because nothing made sense anymore. Where you go when the map you trust no longer applies? At 4 years old, there is no answer to that question. As minutes passed, the environment around him continued its ordinary functions. Cars moved through the town. Doors opened and closed. Life went on, unaware that something essential had broken. This indifference of the world, the way routine persists even as tragedy unfolds, is one of the most painful aspects of disappearance. Noah's fear, whatever its shape, existed inside a landscape that did not respond. When the absence was finally noticed, the collapse spread outward. Calls were made. Names were shouted into yards and alleys. The street transformed from familiar territory into a grid of unknowns. But by then, the critical moment had already passed. Whatever chance existed for immediate recovery had narrowed, possibly closed. Without anyone realizing it at the time, the psychological rupture extended beyond. Noah, his family's internal worlds fractured as well. Panic replaced confusion. Guilt surfaced almost instantly, attaching itself to ordinary decisions made without foresight. The house became a site of interrogation, every object a potential clue, every silence an accusation. Time distorted. Minutes felt like hours. Hours stretched into something unrecognizable. For Noah, the crime or disappearance did not unfold as a single event, but as a sequence of emotional disconnections, separation, waiting, fear without explanation, the absence of reassurance. These are experiences that leave no physical trace, no forensic residue. They exist only in the emotional record, inaccessible and permanent. The town responded with urgency, but urgency cannot reverse time. Search parties formed, spreading outward in widening circles. Fields, sheds, ditches, and abandoned structures were checked and rechecked. Voices carried across distances they had never needed to before. Yet with every passing hour, the likelihood of finding Noah as he had been diminished. The silence that marked his disappearance now expanded, filling spaces where hope had briefly existed. As night approached, the emotional weight deepened. Darkness transformed the search into something more desperate, more fearful. Flashlights cut through shadows that seemed to move on their own. Every unfamiliar sound became a potential signal. For the Price family, the approach of night was unbearable. Sleep became unthinkable. The idea that no one might be alone in the dark was a thought too heavy to articulate. What distinguishes this disappearance from many others is not what is known, but what is not. There is no definitive point of violence, no clear narrative of harm, just a child removed from his world without explanation. That ambiguity has allowed the emotional impact to stretch indefinitely, uncontained by facts or closure. In the days that followed, investigators would attempt to reconstruct the collapse of normalcy, mapping routes, interviewing neighbors, searching for deviations. But emotional collapses do not leave maps. They leave voids. Noah's final experience, his internal response to the sudden failure of safety, remains the most painful unknown of all. By the time the search transitioned from urgent rescue to something quieter and more methodical, the town had already changed. Parents held children tighter. Freedom contracted. Trust eroded. A single silent disappearance had altered the emotional landscape permanently. The crime, if it can be called that, was not just the removal of a child. It was the destruction of certainty. It was the moment when a safe street proved it could not protect its most vulnerable presence. And that realization, once introduced, never leaves. The investigation began in a state of controlled chaos. Within hours of Noah Price being reported missing, Galesburg shifted from neighborly concern to institutional urgency. Local law enforcement moved through the familiar streets with notebooks and radios, attempting to impose order on a situation defined by absence. Every step they took was measured against the clock, the unspoken understanding that time was the most critical and least cooperative variable. Officers started where certainty ended. The Price home became the first focal point, its rooms examined not for what was present, but for what was not. Questions repeated in cycles. When was he last seen? Who was nearby? What was out of place? Each answer felt insufficient, too ordinary to explain such an extraordinary outcome. The family responded through shock, their recollections fragmented by fear. Grief had not yet fully arrived, but its shadow loomed close. Outside, the town participated in the search with a mixture of determination and dread. Volunteers combed through fields and wooded edges, calling Noah's name into spaces that offered no reply. The geography of Galesburg was suddenly unfamiliar, transformed by possibility. Every culvert, every abandoned structure, every stretch of tall grass became a potential site of resolution or despair. The physical labor of searching provided momentary purpose, but it could not quiet the underlying fear that they were already too late. Early investigative efforts were hampered by the very qualities that had once defined the town's safety. People trusted one another. Doors were left unlocked. Children moved freely between homes. There were few records of who came and went. No cameras. No systematic way to track movement. What remained was memory, unreliable and shaped by emotion. Witnesses came forward with impressions rather than facts. Someone remembered a car passing slowly. Another recalled a stranger seen weeks earlier. None of it cohered into a narrative. The Price family began to unravel under the strain. Noah's mother oscillated between frantic action and paralyzing stillness. His father threw himself into the search, driven by the need to do something, anything, that might undo what had already occurred. Their grief manifested differently, creating distance where unity was needed most. The house became a place of tension, every phone ring a potential answer, every silence a reminder of failure. Law enforcement expanded their scope as days passed. Surrounding areas were notified. Flyers were distributed. The case grew outward, but its center remained empty. No new information emerged to anchor the investigation. The absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence, suggesting deliberation without revealing intent. This lack of clarity frustrated investigators and exhausted volunteers, but it also sustained hope. Without proof of harm, the possibility of survival lingered, fragile and painful. The town's emotional state shifted as the search continued. Initial urgency gave way to exhaustion. People returned to work, to obligations, carrying guilt with them. Life resumed not because the crisis had ended, but because it had to. That return to routine felt like a betrayal to the Price family, who remained suspended in time. For them, the world had stopped the moment Noah vanished. Investigators revisited the same locations repeatedly, unwilling to accept the void. They interviewed neighbors multiple times, hoping that repetition might loosen something forgotten. Each effort ended the same way, with more questions than answers. The case began to take on the characteristics of a cold case long before it was officially labeled as such. Momentum slowed. Leads dried up. The urgency that defined the first days could not be sustained indefinitely. Emotionally, the investigation's failures compounded the trauma. Each unsuccessful search reinforced the possibility that Noah would not be found. Hope became something dangerous, something that hurt to hold on to. The family learned to manage their expectations, bracing themselves for disappointment while still needing to believe in resolution. This psychological balancing act would define the years that followed. The town, too, carried the weight of collective responsibility. Whispers circulated. Subtle suspicions formed and dissolved. No one was accused publicly. The trust eroded quietly. Familiar faces were reevaluated through the lens of possibility. The disappearance had introduced doubt into relationships that had once felt unquestionable as weeks turned into months. The investigation lost visibility, but not significance. Files thickened. Notes accumulated. The unanswered questions hardened into a permanent presence. Noah's name remained on lips, but less frequently. The search for answers continued in quieter ways, behind desks rather than in fields. What remained constant was the emotional toll. The Price family lived in a state of unresolved grief, unable to mourn fully without certainty, unable to hope without pain. The investigation had begun with urgency and community support, but it settled into something lonelier, something defined by waiting in the absence of resolution. The case became a mirror reflecting the limits of both community and system. Everyone involved had done something. No one had done enough. And somewhere beyond reach, the truth remained untouched. As the years passed, the disappearance of Noah Price settled into the background of daily life, not because it was forgotten, but because it had nowhere else to go. Time did what it always does in unresolved cases. It moved forward without carrying answers with it. The streets of Galesburg remained the same, but their meaning shifted. What had once felt familiar now carried an undercurrent of caution, a quiet memory embedded into the landscape itself. For the Price family, time did not heal so much as harden. Grief stretched across decades, changing shape but never dissolving. Birthdays came and went, each one marking not growth but absence. Noah remained 4 years old in every photograph, his image suspended permanently in early childhood. The question of who he might have become lingered unspoken, too painful to explore fully, yet impossible to ignore. The case file grew dusty. Leads that once seemed promising lost relevance as witnesses aged, moved away, or died. Memories softened at the edges, no longer sharp enough to withstand scrutiny. What remained were fragments, half-remembered conversations, vague impressions, details that could no longer be verified. The investigation transitioned from active pursuit to quiet maintenance, preserved more out of obligation than optimism. Emotionally, the cold case years were defined by endurance. The Price family learned how to function within uncertainty. They developed rituals that avoided closure while acknowledging loss. Noah's name was still spoken, but carefully, as if too much repetition might erode its meaning. Holidays were structured around what could not be addressed directly. Silence became a coping mechanism, a way to coexist with questions that had no answers. The town carried its own version of the burden. New residents heard the story secondhand, stripped of urgency, but heavy with implication. Parents used it as a cautionary reference, a reminder that safety was not guaranteed. Children grew up with an inherited awareness of what had happened, absorbing the lesson without fully understanding its origin. Noah's disappearance became part of Galesburg's identity, a quiet scar beneath the surface. Investigators revisited the case periodically, often prompted by anniversaries or administrative reviews. Each revisit reopened emotional wounds without providing relief. Files were reorganized. Old interviews were reread. Maps were redrawn. But without new information, these efforts functioned more as acts of remembrance than progress. The truth remained elusive, insulated by time and silence. Psychologically, unresolved loss creates a unique form of grief. There is no definitive moment to begin mourning, no certainty to anchor emotion. The Price family lived in this limbo, suspended between hope and resignation. They imagined scenarios they could not confirm, outcomes they could not accept. The absence of answers became an ongoing presence, shaping decisions, relationships, and emotional boundaries. As decades accumulated, the world around the case evolved. Technology advanced. Investigative standards changed. Yet Noah's disappearance remained fixed in its original context, limited by the tools and assumptions of 1962. The passage of time did not clarify events. It obscured them further. Each year that passed without resolution increased the distance between the present and the truth. Still, memory persisted. Certain places in town never lost their association with the case. The street where Noah was last seen retained a quiet gravity. People slowed there, even if they could not articulate why. Absence leaves impressions that outlast explanation. It alters how space is experienced, how silence is interpreted. For the Price family, the cold case years demanded resilience without reward. They learned how to live alongside unanswered questions, how to carry grief without display. Their endurance was not marked by resolution, but by survival. They continued because there was no alternative, not because the pain had lessened. And then, after so much time had passed that hope had learned to stay quiet, something shifted. Not a solution, not clarity, but movement. A subtle change that suggested the past was not finished speaking after all. The breakthrough did not arrive with certainty or celebration. It surfaced cautiously, as if aware of the weight it carried. Decades after Noah Price vanished, the past stirred in a way it had not before. A voice, long silent, began to speak, not loudly, not publicly, but enough to disrupt the stillness that had settled over the case. For those who had learned to live without answers, the movement itself was destabilizing. It began with a recollection that refused to stay buried. A memory resurfacing late in life, altered by time but sharpened by regret. Someone remembered something they had once dismissed as insignificant. A detail that had not felt important in 1962, when the world still believed in simple explanations. Now, with the distance of years and the erosion of fear, that detail demanded attention. It was not a confession, not yet. It was an admission of proximity. When investigators revisited the case with this new information, the emotional shock rippled outward. For the Price family, the news reopened wounds they had spent decades learning to manage. Hope, once quiet, surged back with painful force. It was not the clean hope of resolution, but the dangerous kind, the kind that risks disappointment. Still, it was impossible to ignore. Something had changed. The silence had been disturbed. The town responded with a mixture of apprehension and unease. Old suspicions resurfaced, names reconsidered, moments re-examined. People looked at one another differently, aware that the past might not be as settled as they had believed. The idea that someone had known something all along introduced a new layer of grief, one shaped by betrayal rather than loss alone. Investigators approached the breakthrough carefully. Time had compromised evidence, blurred memories, altered landscapes. What remained was emotional truth rather than physical proof. Interviews were conducted with sensitivity, acknowledging that the passage of decades had changed not only circumstances, but people themselves. The goal was no longer swift justice, but understanding as more details emerged. A narrative began to take shape, not complete, not definitive, but more coherent than anything before it. The outline of what might have happened replaced the void that had dominated the case for so long. For the first time, Noah's disappearance felt less like an abstraction and more like an event with human contours. Someone had been there. Someone had seen something. Someone had stayed silent. For the Price family, this realization was both devastating and validating. Their instincts, their suspicions, their endless questions had not been misplaced. The years of waiting had not been for nothing. And yet, the cost of that waiting, of all that had been lost in the interim, could not be reclaimed. The breakthrough offered clarity, but it could not restore time. Emotionally, the revelation forced a reckoning. Grief shifted again, reshaping itself around new possibilities. Anger emerged, directed not at fate, but at choice. Silence, once an impersonal force, now felt deliberate. The idea that Noah's fate might have been known, even partially, introduced a pain that was sharper than uncertainty. The town absorbed the news slowly. Conversations grew quieter. Familiar places felt heavier. The past pressed closer to the present, collapsing the distance that time had created. People who had been children in 1962 now found themselves confronting memories they had not fully understood then. The case was no longer just a story from the town's history. It was active again, demanding attention. The breakthrough did not solve the case. It did not answer every question, but it altered the emotional landscape irrevocably. The disappearance of Noah Price was no longer defined solely by absence. It was now shaped by revelation, by the knowledge that the truth had been near all along, waiting for the right moment or the right conscience to surface. What followed would test the limits of what understanding could provide, and whether knowing more could ever truly ease the weight of what had been lost. Truth, when it emerged, arrived in fragments, pieces of memory, confessions weighed by decades, and traces of evidence that had quietly survived the erosion of time. Noah Price's disappearance, long suspended in the static of unanswered questions, began to take form. Not the complete picture, never the complete picture, but enough to make the absence almost tangible. The breakthrough had created a channel, and through it, the past whispered its secrets. The emotional fallout was immediate. For the Price family, clarity brought a surge of relief intertwined with anguish. To know that Noah's last moments could be reconstructed, even partially, offered a form of understanding they had been denied for decades. Yet every revelation reopened the wounds that time had made familiar. Grief, once settled into routine, now throbbed with renewed intensity. Each detail, each recollection, carried the weight of lost years. Investigators found that some witnesses had remembered differently with the passage of time. Faces once thought familiar were re-identified. Roots once forgotten were recalled. The pieces did not cohere neatly. Memory is never linear, especially across decades. But the outlines suggested intent, not accident. Presence, not absence. A child had been removed deliberately, and the silence that followed had been maintained with knowledge. The town, long accustomed to carrying the story quietly, shifted again. Conversations that had previously been hushed grew tentative but pointed. Old friendships bore the strain of newly surfaced suspicion. People revisited the streets, the yards, the corners where Noah had played, seeing them now through the lens of revelation. Even familiar houses, once neutral, took on a gravity they had never held. The past pressed into every present moment, heavy and inescapable. For the family, the revelation was a form of vindication. They had felt the weight of unanswered questions for decades, had been suspended in a liminal space of grief that could not resolve. Now, fragments of understanding confirmed the accuracy of their instincts, the depth of their attention. Yet, knowledge alone did not restore what had been lost. Time, once taken, cannot be returned. Every birthday, every milestone missed, every absence during holidays was etched permanently in the emotional ledger. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Grief transformed again, reshaped by understanding but not mitigated by it. Anger surfaced, not abstract, not toward fate, but toward human action and inaction. Silence, now known to have been intentional in part, became a tangible adversary. The mind works to contain loss, to compartmentalize absence, but clarity dismantled those boundaries. Knowledge forced confrontation with the full scale of the disruption Noah's disappearance had caused. The uncovering of truth also redefined memory. Every recollection of Noah, his small hands, his quiet smile, the way he followed his sister, was now overlaid with the shadow of what had actually happened. Memory, already fragile, became layered with both love and horror. To remember him as he had been while understanding the circumstances of his removal required a reconciliation of emotion that is almost impossible to sustain as the narrative solidified. The town faced a collective reckoning. Galesburg could no longer pretend that the past was simply a story of disappearance. It was a story of human choice, of hidden knowledge, of silence that endured. Families who had been children alongside Noah processed their own memories anew, confronting the implications of what they had overlooked or forgotten. The emotional weight of revelation extended beyond the immediate family. Community identity, long anchored in familiarity and shared memory, shifted. The disappearance, once a cautionary tale of chance and vulnerability, now bore the mark of deliberate action. The collective grief, tempered by decades, flared with renewed intensity. Absence had taken form, and its shape was painful to behold. Yet, even amid the shock and sorrow, a subtle transformation occurred. The understanding, incomplete as it was, allowed a measure of narrative coherence. The void that had defined decades began to solidify into history raw, painful, and human. It was no longer just absence. It was a sequence of events, a chain of decisions, a reflection of both innocence and wrongdoing. And within that chain, Noah's presence, his personality, his routines, his inner life was acknowledged in ways that absence had previously denied. The revelation was not resolution. It did not undo loss. It did not restore the years that had been stolen. But it allowed the Price family and the town to engage with truth rather than shadow. It offered a way to process grief in a dimension that absence alone had never permitted. By the time the full scope of the revelation settled, the emotional intensity surrounding Noah Price's disappearance reached its peak. Decades of unanswered questions, accumulated grief, and generational silence converged into a moment that was both unbearable and necessary. The town, the family, and the few remaining witnesses were forced to reckon with the consequences of time, choice, and absence all at once. For the Price family, understanding came as a double-edged sword. On one side was clarity. Fragments of truth, however incomplete, affirmed what they had long felt in the marrow of their bones. Noah's last known experiences, his movements, his interactions, the moments of vulnerability, they were no longer entirely conjecture, And yet, the knowledge carried its own grief. Each detail confirmed what had been lost forever. The birthdays, uncelebrated, the milestones unseen, the ordinary life a child deserved but never received, all remained irretrievable. Emotionally, this period was characterized by a strange blend of relief and devastation. Relief that the silence had finally cracked, devastation at the revelation of human complicity and deliberate choice. Memory and grief intertwined. The family and community had spent years shaping their lives around absence, learning to live with uncertainty. The arrival of clarity did not erase that time. It reframed it, forcing a confrontation with decades of waiting. The town, too, felt the reverberations. Streets that had once seemed ordinary now carried a charged stillness. Every corner, every porch, every empty lot where children had played became a locus of reflection and remembrance. Conversations, previously hushed, gained texture and gravity. The shared grief that had been diffuse, almost intangible, coalesced into recognition. This was no longer a story of disappearance alone. It was a story of interrupted lives and choices that left permanent marks. Memory, both collective and individual, shifted under the weight of revelation. People recalled Noah not just as a boy who vanished, but as a presence whose absence had shaped them. They remembered his quiet attentiveness, the subtle ways he interacted with the world, and the small gestures that had made him human. Those memories, once abstract, became anchors in a newly framed narrative, painful, yes, but profoundly humanizing. As the family processed the emotional peak of these revelations, meaning began to form. Not full justice, not a return to what was lost, but a comprehension that their grief, their enduring search, and their resilience had not existed in vain. Each piece of recovered truth, each acknowledgement of what had been endured, created a fragile scaffold upon which understanding could rest. The community, too, began to recognize the cumulative effect of absence, silence, and secrecy, acknowledging that these were not just personal wounds but communal ones as well. Through the unraveling of decades-old mystery, the psychological landscape of Galesburg was altered irrevocably. People realized that grief is not a linear process. That memory carries weight long after events fade from immediate awareness, and that the acts or inactions of the past reverberate far into the present. The town's identity, once anchored in quiet routines, now included the deep, persistent echo of Noah's life and disappearance. Ultimately, the final unraveling brought a profound awareness of what persists when a life is interrupted. Time, memory, and absence intertwine, leaving traces that shape families, communities, and individual psyches. And yet, amid the emotional complexity and enduring sorrow, there emerges a measure of resolution, the ability to recognize, to remember, and to bear witness to what once was and what was taken. The resolution of Noah Price's story does not come as a tidy conclusion, nor does it offer full justice. Instead, it arrives in the quiet recognition of what has been lost and the fragile acceptance of truths long deferred. The Price family, now older, carries the weight of decades with a dignity forged by endurance. Their grief, shaped by absence and revelation, has become a companion rather than a tormentor, an ever-present reminder of the child who should have grown among them. Guy L.S. Berg, too. There's the imprint of that absence. Streets, houses, and yards are the same as they were in 1962, yet the memory of what happened has altered their meaning. The town's collective consciousness carries Noah's presence in ways both subtle and profound. A shared caution, a muted awareness, a vigilance born from love and fear. His disappearance became a lens through which generations measure both vulnerability and care, shaping the small decisions of everyday life. Emotionally, the Price family finds closure not in knowing every detail, but in understanding enough to humanize the void. Noah is remembered not only as a missing child, but as a person, sensitive, observant, dependent, loved. His routines, his small gestures, his quiet attentiveness all endure in memory, reinforced by the fragments of truth that finally emerged. In that remembrance, he continues to exist, unaltered by time or absence, inhabiting the emotional space his family has preserved for him. The psychological resonance of the case lingers. Absence, silence, and unresolved grief leave their marks, yet the passage of time allows integration. The family and the town have navigated decades of uncertainty, learning to carry questions alongside memory, pain alongside love. This balance is delicate, never complete, but it provides a framework for living alongside what cannot be changed. In doing so, they honor Noah's life in the most enduring way possible, through remembrance and emotional fidelity. The story of Noah Price ultimately becomes a meditation on time, memory, and loss. It is a reminder that even the smallest lives cast shadows long enough to shape communities, that silence can persist across decades, and that truth, when it finally surfaces, does not erase grief, but transforms it. Absence, once immutable, is given form through understanding, narrative, and witness. The emotional arc, from disappearance through revelation, underscores the enduring power of love, observation, and persistence in the face of incomprehensible loss. For viewers wishing to continue exploring stories of memory, loss, and unresolved mysteries, selecting another documentary in this series allows the journey to extend, offering new perspectives on lives interrupted and the enduring human struggle to reconcile absence with understanding. Noah Price remains in the quiet corners of memory, in the subtle gestures of remembrance, and in the way a community continues to measure its own safety, love, and vigilance. His story, though incomplete in the world of tangible outcomes, finds its resolution in recognition, empathy, and the unbroken witness of those who never cease to care.